Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Shape Live. We are very pleased that you are joining us from wherever you are in the world. It's great to have you here, and as we see the numbers coming up, more people are joining us. So thank you again to today's Shape Live session. My name is Graham Seed. I'm the European Research Manager at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. So I've been working here at Cambridge for nearly 15 years now, and before that I was an EFL teacher. So the topic we're going to look at today is one that's very close to my heart and I'm personally very interested in as well. And I have, of course, the privilege of hosting our session today on the role of English in education. So we know, of course, that English can bring access to education and jobs, promote social mobility and connect people. In short, English can transform lives, and parents, schools and governments across the world have bought into that need for English. And at all stages of life, work and education, and at an even earlier age nowadays. But we know that some things need to change. The role of English and how it's taught needs care. Oh, there we go. I'm back here. I think I'm back now. Sorry about that. Great. Thanks everybody again for joining, and apologies for that. So I was just saying we are now going to have our speakers here to help us think about the role of English in education. So we are first going to hear from Stephen Dobson. And so, Stephen, if you can just quickly show yourself on screen and say hello to us. There we go.
Good evening, everybody.
Hi, so Stephen is Dean of the Faculty of Education at Herenga, Waka, Victoria, University of Wellington in New Zealand. And thank you, Stephen, for joining us at this reasonably late hour in New Zealand. Stephen's going to get us thinking about how English, despite noble intentions, can disrupt national education policies and practices in non-English speaking countries, and whether the English language model can work more closely with other curricula to demonstrate greater cultural sensitivity. So Stephen, we'll come to you in just 1 minute. And just to introduce Professor Lina Mukhopadhyay, she is from the School of English Language Education at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad in India. So hello, Lina. Lina will be sharing some of the challenges faced in India and insights from her recent work in Indian classrooms into multilingual or translanguaging pedagogy. And we'll be thinking about whether such practices hold a key to the future of English in education. And we'll also welcome Professor Ianthi Tsimpli. So hello, Ianthi from the University of Cambridge, who will be joining us later for our Fireside chat. That's later in our session. Ianthi and Lina have been working together on the Multi-Lila project, which is a 4-year interdisciplinary project examining cognitive, linguistic and mathematical abilities of multilingual Indian learners and the attitudes, language choices and practices of language and mathematics teachers. So we'll hear a bit about that later. We're also going to be posing questions to our panelists in our fireside chat in about 20 minutes time. And we'd love to bring in your observations and questions. So please do add them in the chat as we go along. Please also use our hashtag, which is #ShapeLive, when sharing in your networks. If you can't stay for the whole event, then a recording will be available later at shapeeducation.org. So we are going to start off with a poll in the chat for you, which will come up now. We'd like to know from you who you think is driving demands for English in education. So we're talking about both learning English and learning other subjects in English as well. Who is driving that demand for the need to have English in education? The options should be on your screen now. So there are some thoughts there. Are there government entities, regulatory bodies such as exam boards, employers, universities, school leadership, parents, learners? Perhaps to some extent all of them are, but which is the key driving that demand there? Or maybe it's another group of people or person, in which case please tell us in the chat as well. So please take part in a live poll, and we look at the results of that poll later on. So first of all, then now let's actually get started, and I am now going to hand over to Stephen Dobson to get us going. So Stephen, thank you again for joining us from New Zealand to speak to us today. I think a lot of people say that the English language is key to unlocking all sorts of doors in terms of employment and further study, migration, etc. But what cautions might you give to that point of view? It's over to you for your talk now.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you for this invitation. It would be amiss if I didn't answer in a way which is important in the New Zealand context, where it's a bicultural culture with the Māori people and the English people. And the way I just start is say, call Stephen Dobson out. My name is Stephen Dobson. Me no tatu, whakatakateho ki te ura, whakatakateho ki te tunga, makina kina ki utak, mataratara ki tai eke ona te atukura, hei tio, hei huka, hei ho, ti hei Māori ora. And that basically means let's calm the winds from the north and the south. And that's how it's an accepted way of opening meetings in the New Zealand context, whether you can speak lots and lots of the Māori language called te reo or English. And part of what I'd say very quickly is it's about the connection between the languages in which English is embedded and how you make allowances for other cultures. And that's probably the main message of where I'd like to get to. But let's take a step backwards. I've lived here for some years and moved around from different countries. And my background is not as a linguist, but trying to understand some of the effects that the English language has had on different cultures, which are in a way a long way away from where it all started in England or the UK. And what I'm interested in, so why has English become that gold standard out in the world where other languages are the mother tongues? What kind of effects has this had? And what exactly are those impacts? And how might we come to terms with that in a way which accommodates other languages and cultures and things? So some of my thoughts, or say all of my thoughts, have been developed with a colleague of mine called Muhammad Zudi in Indonesia. So we've used that as kind of a case study. He's based in Indonesia. And if you think about English, what we say is it's very much become a universal language, probably outdoing Spanish and Russian and many other different languages, and German and Chinese to some extent, and many Indian dialects. And this is a long history. It's not happened immediately. It's also to do with that colonial history and how England has gradually left its mark. And today it's quite interesting. If you look at the British Council and you type in the word English effect, what you find is the way England is portrayed as it's an important way of providing a competitive edge from culture to media to commerce and power, soft power. They phrase it boost stability and employability and prosperity in so-called emerging economies, and that it's generated a great demand. So to answer some of those opening points you made, Graham, it has an important way of building understanding and culture and business. I mean, it's unfair to say the British Council doesn't note that it might have, we shouldn't be too much reliant on English, but it's definitely had a very strong impact or an effect on what happens in other countries. So what exactly happens? So in a country such as Indonesia, to use this case, you'll find the International Baccalaureate, you'll find paradoxically Cambridge International, and we're talking in an event here arranged by Cambridge Assessment and Education. You'll find other multiple curricula, such as the Singapore curriculum. And what has happened is that this is a very big culture, over 260 million people, and obviously Bahasa is the main language. But what has happened is for the, let's call it the more socially mobile groups, it has become a passport to either prosperity within Indonesia. It guarantees you employment, it guarantees you advances, or leaving the country and attending other language institutions. So it's become very much a passport to prosperity for those that can speak it. And the interesting thing is within the country is there was a time around the early 2000s where actually it was mandated every school district had to offer at least one school that offered an English language curriculum rather than the Bahasa or the national Indonesian curriculum. That now has become unconstitutional, and yet some schools still exist. So the impact has been that this has become a way of saying what is the gold standard within a country where they speak a totally different language. And it intensifies different divisions between classes, and to take those curriculums is obviously connected with wealth and Western values. My colleague Zudi puts it in the following way. There's a challenge that certain people will identify more with the Western culture, its pop culture, its language, its identity, than with their own language, which also creates challenges for the youth growing up. And I'm not sure if that's exactly how we would want to be portrayed, those that are English, as almost like a colonizing force and things. So what are the ways of looking at it here? Part of the challenge is when English impacts within other countries, it becomes a form of performance or assessment, and it doesn't always match the values. In the Indonesian context, they have something called tabia, which is all education should embrace values that match the culture, and it should be a way of teaching in a holistic fashion. Sometimes when English is taught in other cultures, it's about assessment rather than balancing those values that are in existence in that particular culture. This is not to say we should stop speaking English. It's more about, from my view, how can you balance the gold standard view of English as a language to be taught, spoken, understood, bridging cultures, with other values, some of them to do with performance, but also to do with paying attention to other cultures, looking after people, including other people, rather than sometimes doing the exact opposite. So I don't have the solutions that maybe my colleague Lina has, but it definitely leaves its mark on other cultures. And even in New Zealand, it would be the same. It has a dominant role, but there are language revivals around the world for local languages and other languages. And I think I'll just close there and say thank you so far, and I look forward to discussing more in the fireside chat. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you very much. I think that's a very thought-provoking start to our session today to get us thinking about, okay, well, English has its place, but then what's its effect on the society that uses it, and how can we encourage perhaps those cultural interactions that may be needed? So thank you. We'll certainly come back to you during the fireside chat. And if you have any questions for Stephen, please put them in the chat in YouTube. We'll come to them later. We won't come to them right now. Please do keep adding your questions in the chat there for Stephen and for Lina as we move on to Lina. Let's look at the results of our poll, which we asked you who is driving the demand for English in education, and a wide variety of answers there. But the top result was employers. 27% of you said that the employers are looking for those with English skills, followed by governments or government entities at 19%, and parents as well, showing strongly at 18%. So that's really interesting there. Very, very interesting. Good. Okay. So we will go on now. We're going to ask you another question as a poll in the chat. And we'd like to know who are the main resistors to changing the role of English in education. So who is blocking any change that we come to? And again, the same list of actors or stakeholders are there. So government entities, regulatory bodies, employers, universities, school leadership, parents, learners, or maybe somebody else. Okay, so who are the main resistors? So as you're listening to Lina's talk, maybe that will give you some inspiration, or you have your own ideas as to who are the main resistors to changing the role of English in education. So we're now going to hand over to Lina to hear about her work. So Lina, again, thank you very much for joining us today. Lina, you've been working in India, which is a country that's known for the many languages that are spoken there, and therefore its multilingualism, but also a country that for historical colonial reasons has used and continues to use English widely. Can you tell us a little bit about the context there, and more importantly about the work that you've been doing in schools in that country? So over to you for your 10-minute talk.
Thank you, Graham. I'd like to begin my discussion today, taking on what Stephen just discussed about the situation of New Zealand. And the situation in India is not very different from what he portrayed about New Zealand. And so it would be easier for me to build the link from there, namely that if English is supposed to provide us with a gold standard, then why is it that it is not as prosperous or as successful in the context of education worldwide? So India would be a good case in point, because there has been post-independence, there has been a lot of pressure from parents and also from the government to introduce English in the mainstream education for larger purposes. And it has come to a state that right now many states in India are considering whether they should start English as the medium of education right from the primary years, which in a way as an idea sounds good, because if English is the pathway to education and higher forms of life, prosperity, job, etc., and also probably building a good career in terms of going abroad, etc., then it sounds fantastic. But the ground reality is that there are some challenges that we need to, we cannot brush them under the carpet, and we need to acknowledge them. And at the same time, we cannot wish away English. So my presentation would be to talk about the Indian educational context, especially in relation to the work that we have been doing with Professor Ianthi Tsimpli from the University of Cambridge as a part of a four-year-long interdisciplinary project, and some of the findings that we have from the project. So just give me a moment. I would like to share my screen. and I keep it very short. I'm proposing a kind of a solution to the fact that, as I said, that English education is becoming more and more important in the primary school context, and then thereafter in high school, tertiary levels, so on and so forth. So if we wish to keep a balance between English and the rich multilingual and multicultural variety that India has, and bring in a kind of a positive and balanced bilingualism, then what could be a way forward? So what research has shown us from India, that there are several issues in terms of language education challenges. And the first and foremost being that, English as a language ranges from being a second language. For some, it is also like a near native language to a foreign language in the country, based on the socio-economic background of the learners and their corresponding access to education. So if they have access to education, they come from a middle income group family or a higher income group family, then the transition from home language to English is not that difficult. However, in majority of the learners' cases, this is not the case, and they come from low socioeconomic background families, and therefore they are largely at a disadvantage when we propose that English should be the medium of instruction from very early stages. Because what happens is, what gets hit is reading comprehension, which is the backbone of education, and lack of literacy practices at home, exposure to the target language, inadequate oral proficiency in the language puts majority of them at risk for reading comprehension. And this results in subsequent dropout. So if like today's session is, the title of the session is Lost in Translation. So can we have a way forward from being lost in translation to using translation through a socio-cognition framework to support emerging language and more specifically reading development? So recent research from Multilida that I just mentioned, and Professor Ianthi Maria Tsimpli is also present, who will join us for the Fireside session. So that Multilida is a multidisciplinary project, and it has shown us that children from low socioeconomic families can decode English texts, but when it comes to reading for meaning, they are at a loss. And their expected lexical knowledge or lexical coverage is much higher than what their actual lexical knowledge is in the target language. So both of these things put together shows us that they are in a situation where their reading comprehension could be at risk, and it could lead to subsequent dropouts. However, at the same time, what we have seen is when the medium of instruction is like Hindi or Telugu, which overlaps with their home language, then reading comprehension seems to be age appropriate. And we found that teachers make translingual language choices in the classes to aid comprehension and mathematics learning. So these are the 4 basic tenets of the Multilida project, based on which I would now like to propose a way out, that on the one hand, as I said, that there is a lot of governmental initiative and pressure to build primary schools on the basis of English medium instruction. And at the same time, as teachers and educators, we know that multilingual children come with a lot of L1 resources. So how we could use those resources in a socio-constructivist cognitive framework to support their reading comprehension development. So therefore, let us quickly look at the prerequisites to reading development. I mean, this is something that is common knowledge, but this is just to reiterate in the mind that if we were to think of using the translingual mode or using the L1 resources of the learners, then what are the things that we need to keep in mind? So of course, there is oral proficiency in the language, then vocabulary or lexical coverage, background knowledge, inference generation at several levels, and the possibility of cognitive academic language transfer from the stronger to the emerging language. And of course, the presence of target language exposure outside class, which seems slightly problematic in this context because it is hardly present for these set of learners outside class. And then there are lots of other effective and survival factors which come into the fore. So keeping these factors in mind, we are about to start off another project which is funded by the British Academy. And again, it is spearheaded by Professor Ianthi Tsimpli, and we are going to work in India, where we are looking at the development of Indian primary school children's reading comprehension skills. And we are using a scaffolding-based, we're going to use a scaffolding-based intervention. So this is like a rough model that we have kind of prepared, keeping in mind that these children have their L1 resources, and their cognitive resources with respect to reading comprehension is quite developed in their L1 or a language which is closer to their home language, and therefore can we build their reading comprehension in English based on these premises. So we have kind of thought of a socio-constructivist framework where the reading development can be scaffolded on one hand through their development of lexical coverage, and then we look at reading comprehension at two levels, namely inference generation at the lexical level, at the propositional level, and the pragmatic level. And then we go on to the level of whole text comprehension, so that they are able to retain ideas and talk about the entire text. And this kind of a skill building would be across disciplines. So it would not be only beneficial for them in the English language classroom, but also other subjects. So this is kind of the model that we have in mind. And at every step, we have this conscious awareness that we would be using multiple language resources. So wherever possible, we would be supporting the development of the target language through the route of the L1 resources, both cognitively as well as linguistically. And therefore, we would focus on the lexical development and then going on to comprehension at the in-text comprehension and then whole text comprehension. And then there would be several activities which will be supported through peers. So it would not be a teacher-centered model, but it would be more of a learner-centered model where the peers can, through discussion with one another, reach at an understanding of awareness, noticing certain linguistic features, so on and so forth. So this is kind of the model that we have thought. And the rationale for this model, as I said, that although we will have to, cater to the English demands, the rising English demands of the learners and their parents, but at the same time, we would have to think of a situation or of a model where we in a healthy way can support their L1 resources in order to build their, further cognitive thinking, cognitive skills in a language which is not so well developed. So we take the help of languages which are well developed in their mind, and then we help them develop language proficiency in the emerging language. So this is the reason why we are proposing a translanguaging reading model. And as Graham was asking at the beginning of my, discussion, that what is the situation in India, and how is it that we can, think of the use of English in a balanced, positive manner. So I would stop with that, and I hope I've kept to the time, Graham.
Great, you have perfectly. Thank you, Lina, so much. That's very interesting, and very interesting to hear of a solution or a possible solution to the issues, or some of the issues that Stephen was raising earlier, and talking about that notion of translanguaging, how to integrate all the languages in an individual's plurilingual repertoire into their education for the benefit of all of them. So thank you, Lina. Really interesting to hear about that case study in India. We'll come back to you in a minute, and the other speakers as well in our fireside chat. Let's firstly just take a look at the poll. So the second poll, we asked you, who are the main resistors to changing the role of English in education? Who's blocking that change? And the top answer there is government entities. 36% of your answers said the governments are the ones who are blocking that, and maybe they have that fixed mindset of making sure that everybody studies English. But closely behind are the parents at 29% of your responses. So that's also very interesting that maybe the parents have the fixed views. Okay, so what we're going to do now, please keep putting your questions and your comments in the chat there. There's some comments there already. We'll get to those in a minute, but please do continue to put your questions in. We are going to open up now to our fireside chat, and I'd like to bring in Professor Ianthi Tsimpli from the University of Cambridge again. So thank you, Ianthi, for joining us today. You'll be joining the other two speakers in the Fireside chat discussion in a minute. But to begin with, I just want to ask you, Ianthi, would you like to respond to anything that Stephen and Lina have said? Obviously, you've been working with Lina, so maybe there's something you'd like to add to that. But maybe Stephen's context is a bit new for you, I don't know. Please, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think both speakers actually raised very interesting issues that complement each other. I don't want to say much in relation to the particular presentations because they were, I think, quite comprehensive in the way they were, you know, as brief presentations. I just wanted to raise the issue of what English means for different parts of the world, because I think that we are trying to translate our perception of English into an educational practices, depending on the part of the world we live in. So, for instance, you know, in countries where English is the aspiration, but the country itself is primarily unilingual. So, I mean, there is one, let's say, majority language that people learn and use, and this is not English, then English is aspired to as a language perhaps of commerce and so on, as a lingua franca. And speakers there will try to develop English perhaps as a subject in the school system and eventually move on to, let's say, English medium education at secondary school or university level. But in other countries like India, or South Africa, or, you know, Malaysia or Singapore, where there are many languages, you know, so the multilingualism is the norm. People do not restrict themselves to a unilingual practice. They actually switch between languages all the time, and they do it not only in informal context, but also in formal contexts. And so that raises the question and brings me to what Lina was suggesting about translanguaging. So translanguaging may actually not be panacea, you know, may not work for all countries around the world, but it may work for very well for countries where speakers are used to switch between different languages. And so using multilingual resources to teach English, among other things, might be a way to go and build on, you know, a gradual way of developing knowledge of a new language, English, which will eventually be possible to use both unilingually, so independently as English on its own, or with other languages. So I think what we are missing at the moment at the educational level is sensitivity to diversity in terms of language practices around the world. And I think English educators need to become aware of this diversity before they suggest or advise on which method is the best to introduce English. Because in India as well, for many years, the idea was that we impose what we know and love as English, you know, language instruction from Europe and North America and transfer it to India. But actually, that doesn't take into account not only the culture, but the language culture, the way languages work in this in these countries that are inherently multilingual and linguistically diverse. So my suggestion is that when we talk about education, we respect culture not only at the level of general culture, but also at the level of language culture. And this is fundamentally different in some of the countries of the global South compared to Europe and North America.
Great, thank you very much, Ianthi. So let's open up the question, the fireside chat time. So Lina and Stephen, please give your views as well. And maybe Stephen, if I could start with you. You've obviously told us a little bit about the situation in New Zealand and in Indonesia. And you've now heard a little bit about the situation in India. Maybe you knew a little bit about that already. But how would you react to the solution that's proposed by Lina and Ianthi of implementing a translanguaging, a plurilingual, and I guess with that, a pluricultural education? Do you agree that that is a potential solution to some of the issues that you raised?
Yeah, I really like your deeply expert educational view, Ianthi and Lina. And I have almost like a question or something in my mind, or it's kind of connected, is that often, and what the polls have shown, it's very much to do with what the parents want. And I wonder if it's something about the language that's going on in the families or between families. And I wondered if you could maybe kind of help me understand the importance of the families, not just looking for prosperity, but how they kind of mirror some of the ambitions and the practices in the school. That was my first point, because that's obviously a key here, what happens in the families or between families. And the other one I wondered is, well, I've never ceased to be amazed by the power of young people and the electronic devices they use, playing games and in multi-languages. They never seem to be particularly bothered about what language the other kids are playing. So I wondered if you could kind of help me understand, in a way, the lack of power of parents or the ways they navigate this, and the power of kids and all their digital worlds.
Yeah, please, Lina or Ianthi, do you want to respond to that?
Stephen, that's a very interesting question that you have asked, and again, I would like to answer that in a way that would speak for the majority of the learners. So, when English is a language of education with the middle class children or the high economic group, then there is apparently no critical issue, because they somehow or the other pick up the language and they are able to survive in the medium of instruction, and in future they are able to prosper. So on one hand, it is true that if they have access to education through English, then they do seem to have somehow they seem to hit upon this gold standard that English promises. But when it comes to the low socioeconomic class, and then in India, we are experiencing a lot interstate migration. So the interstate migration is mostly of the unskilled laborers, and also of the laborers who are skilled, but then they are in a very low paying jobs, and most of the times they just have probably primary education, and many a times they don't even have that. So what happens is, with these kids, so for so many years, let's say for the last 20-25 years, for these kids to go to schools where English would be a subject was not that problematic. But when they make a transition of making English as the medium of instruction, then it is like, on the one hand, there is aspiration of English and there is promise of English, etc., etc. But we are actually consciously blocking their access to education, because we are expecting that they would think in a language and they would show comprehension abilities in a language, which neither do they come across, in a big way outside class. And I'm talking about the rich communicative use of the language, I mean, in day-to-day life. It's not like just in sporadically, in boardings, or because many social linguistics make a big deal of it, that English is outside everywhere. But what is required for comprehension at the oral as well as print level, that is hugely lacking. And if we are expecting that overnight they would develop comprehension skills or mathematics skills, for example, which are the cornerstones of primary education, then we are making a huge mistake. But the point is, this is, the government always go by the popular demands, and because they want their vote banks to be intact, so on and so forth. So there is a danger of, overnight changing the medium of instruction to English and expecting that these children would be able to survive in the system. And so we are making it doubly difficult for them, in the name of English, that we are actually blocking their access to education. We are not preparing them to make the transition from, their stronger language to an emerging language. So in that case, okay, on the face of it, we can accept, we can't do much about the government policy, but then as teachers or as educators, if we acknowledge this issue and we are able to, in smaller pockets, that's what Multi-Lila and the other two projects are hoping to do, that through the intervention study, that in smaller pockets, if we are able to raise teacher awareness and prepare them to deal with multiple languages, or as Professor Ianthi was suggesting, that because mixing languages, doing translanguaging is so common for most of the Indians in most contexts, that if that could be built into the classroom context, probably that would be a way out, and then they would be able to build their comprehension skills in the language, and also probably build their subject knowledge through that language.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go on. I just want to pick up on the point that in the poll, it was the governments who came out top as the blockers. And I wondered if, in your experience, and this is a question to all three of you, what suggestions might you give to national governments about how they should develop how English is learnt and assessed? What actual practical steps can they implement, maybe through examples that you've seen already that work, or just things that you really need governments to do in order to implement some of the things that you have been advocating? So maybe, Ianthi, could I start with you? What would you ask governments to do?
Well, first of all, I think that, as I said in my previous point, governments know or should know the language, the linguistic landscape of their countries best, right? So that means that they shouldn't import without filtering and without monitoring models that have worked in other parts of the world, but actually are not sensitive to their own linguistic landscape. So that's the first thing. I think there are some universal, let's say, educational practices that seem to work because they are based on cognitive and psychological sort of aspects of language development and cognitive development and child development. And I think these are borrowable, they can be listened to and adopted by different governments. But when it comes to the choice of language, I think there are two things that we need to keep in mind. You don't need to have a language as a medium of instruction to learn it. You can learn a language without having it as a medium of instruction. So you can learn English and have it as a subject among the other school subjects that you have, if it is taught properly, right? I mean, you've got enough input there. And in fact, if you are multilingual anyway, as is the case in India, where you are likely to speak when you are an adult 4 or 5 languages on average, English or another language will not be a problem for you. So I think that what we need to keep in mind is that learning English and aspiring towards, being fluent in English does not necessitate English as the medium of instruction. I mean, I myself, grew up in a country where English was not the medium of instruction, but English was a compulsory subject. And you know, you can learn the language, right? I mean, that's not the problem. And in fact, maybe it was more of a problem for me coming from a more monolingual background than for an Indian child, okay, coming from it's likely that they come from a much more multilingual background. So I think there are two things that governments need to consider. First, the efficiency of using English, of imposing English as a medium of instruction. In contexts like India, particularly when there are no resources back home, you know, to support that learning. And secondly, that they need to refrain from imposing models from elsewhere, and they need to support their own researchers, you know, to find out what the best way is to suggest, you know, educational models that would work in their own domain.
Great, thank you. I mean, I can't believe it. Our time is nearly at an end already. I've been having a look through the comments that people have been putting in the chat here. I don't think there are any direct questions, but all very interesting and relevant points, and thanking our speakers for picking up on certain points. So unfortunately our time is at an end already. So I really would like to say a huge, massive thank you to our speakers, Stephen Dobson, Lina Mukhopadhyay and Ianthi Tsimpli, for joining us today and bringing some really interesting and fascinating insights from different places across the globe, and letting us think about, okay, well, what does that mean? And I think the takeaway message is actually in different places there are different contexts, and we can implement multilingual, multicultural policies, but we've got to be sensitive to that context. But please carry on this conversation. We want to carry on, and so do stay in touch with Shape Education, and in our future live streams as well, and our upcoming bigger Shape events that we hold as well. So if you're interested in staying in touch and being involved, please register at shapeeducation.org. And I wish you a lovely rest of your day or evening or night if you're in New Zealand, and hope to see you at another event soon. And thank you once again to you for joining us, and to our speakers today for their input as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.